you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first of our webinar series on MTSS with a focus on equity. We are excited for this opportunity to showcase these topics throughout the year, and we're excited that you took time out of your busy schedules to join us today. And we're hopeful that the remaining sessions you'll find to be useful to support your own equity journey. I'm going to introduce myself and then turn it over to my esteemed colleague to introduce herself, and then we'll get started. My name is Dr. Nikole Hollins-Sims. I'm an educational consultant at the PaTTAN Harrisburg office. I primarily support the Behavior Initiative, the MTSS Initiative, as well as school psychology. And I'm also currently a special advisor to the Department of Education supporting equitable practices. Very happy to be here. Amira?
Thanks so much, Nikole. My name is Amira Hill-Yancy. I'm also an educational consultant. However, I'm out of the Malvern East office. I work primarily on the Special Education Law Initiative. I support federal grants, and I'm also working on the MTSS initiative, specifically doing equity work. So I'm really excited to be here presenting with my colleague this morning and for the rest of the series.
So again, welcome everyone. Please just take note that we will be taking a 15-minute break during this session. In addition to that, we welcome your comments and questions in the chat box. When I'm presenting, Amira will be manning the chat and vice versa. So if you do have any specific questions or comments, if there's a need, we may interrupt the session and address that question in the moment. Otherwise, we'll try to wait until the end and have some dialogue around some of those questions too. You will also notice that in the chat box, our support staff member, Tina Reif, she's amazing. She's on currently, and she will be populating an attendance link. So please look for that Google link in the chat box. You will need to complete that so that you can record your attendance for the sessions for Act 48 purposes. So please keep an eye out for that link in the chat box throughout this opening portion of the session. In a moment as well, we will also populate a Google link for the materials for today's session. You will be able to access the folder marked September 22nd, and there is the PDF of the PowerPoint as well as other materials and content. That will be the official Google link for the webinar series. The other folders that you see there are marked and designated for the dates of the upcoming sessions, which are as follows. And so just so we can kind of get a lay of the land on what it is that you signed up for, essentially today we are talking about database decision-making in MTSS. In November, we're going to highlight professional learning and self-awareness. That's one I know myself and Amira are super excited to present to you. We're then going to move into shared ownership in MTSS, and that's looking at equity in supports. And those supports could come from special educators. Those supports could come from school psychologists, from counselors, from social workers. We want to address how we can all take ownership of the students we support. Then we'll move into March and highlight transformational leadership and equity. And it's important to not be transactional in our leadership, but transformational, because this work should transform the systems that we're supporting. And then lastly, we're going to focus on equitable and authentic family and community engagement, and that will be highlighted in May. So we're excited and we're hopeful that you'll stick it out with us throughout the whole year, because we know that it will be important content for your work. In any PaTTAN session, it is important for us to highlight the mission. So I'm going to read this out for you. The mission of the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, PaTTAN, is to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education and to build the capacity of local educational agencies to serve students who receive special education services. The department's commitment to the least restrictive environment is highlighted here. Our goal for each child is to ensure IEP teams begin with the general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. And when we talk about equity, equity again highlights special education as well as other groups that we know exist in our schools. And so PaTTAN's mission and our commitment are noted here. However, the content that we will review is applicable to many different groups that you see in schools. So in every session that I do, I think it's important to ground us in why we're here. And so James Baldwin, who is a famous African-American novelist, essayist, and social critic, gave the following quote. He notes that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And we're at a very key moment in time. And James Baldwin is no longer with us, unfortunately, but what he says here and the things that if you would look back on some of his previous work could easily fit in the context of 2020. And the reason why I believe most of you are here is because we want to do something different. And the only way for us to do that is to be able to know what it is we need to do differently. And so that's essentially what he's highlighting. We can no longer stand by and be okay with some of the things that we see in schools and educational systems that we know are impacting students in a negative way. And so James Baldwin really gives us that charge that it's important for us to take that ownership and move ahead. And so with that, I think it's important that we sort of ground ourselves in how we're going to interact in these sessions. One thing to keep in mind is that some of these conversations may become intense. They may challenge some of your thinking or thought processes around what you thought to be true, but also may make you think in a different way. And so as we engage in this, I think it's important to set some ground rules, if you will, or agreements. You'll notice that I don't use the term norms because, again, when we use norms, we insinuate that it's normal or we're using a dominant approach to how we interact. And every culture, no matter what, presents with different nuances. And so agreements insinuates sharing the power dynamic, if you will. And so Glenn Singleton, who wrote Courageous Conversations About Race, highlights 4 agreements for a courageous conversation. And I'm just gonna give them out for us in a moment. Number 1 is to stay engaged. We understand that throughout this session and other sessions that you may participate in, you may be at a classroom, you may be in an office, you may be in a conference room, you may be at your desk at home. There are many distractions that can happen throughout. We understand that and we recognize that. However, the content that we're going to cover is so important that we're hopeful that even if you are somewhat distracted and or somewhat resistant, that you still remain engaged with the content and try to accept and understand some of the thoughts that might be presented. We would ask also that you speak your truth. That is so important, being your authentic selves. And in situations like this, that's not always easy to begin, especially when you may be uncomfortable with some of the content. But in speaking your truth, it helps others to understand your perspective and also to think about how we could all learn and grow from each other. Number 3 is that experiencing discomfort is normal and natural, and it should happen. The only way that change occurs is when discomfort happens. When we're comfortable, we become complacent and we think about things in a blind spot, that everything's okay, there's no need to change. Discomfort makes us say, wow, what could I be doing differently? And so it's okay to be uncomfortable, and we hope that you push through that discomfort to remain engaged. And then number 4 is to expect and accept non-closure. This work, the work of anti-racism, the work of anti-sexism, all of the isms that we want to dismantle require us to go for it in the long haul. This is not something that will be solved in a year-long webinar series. The hope that Amira and I have is that through this year-long webinar series, you begin to build up your skill sets and your levels of understanding so that you can move forward and knowing that the journey is long and should remain ongoing. And so those are the 4 agreements that we're grounding these sessions around. And we're hopeful that you'll take these agreements into your daily practice when you're engaging in this type of work. And so we have a few rules. At one point throughout the session, we are going to have a breakout session. And for those particular portions, we're having about 10 minutes for those sessions. We would ask that when you are assigned, that someone would volunteer to be a timekeeper or a note taker. We want you to think about those 4 agreements because, again, you're going to have the open dialogue time. And just know that we will broadcast the amount of time that's remaining so that you can begin to wrap conversation. With the amount of people that we have, and I'm taking a look, we're at 141 now, 10 minutes may not be enough for everyone to have their chance to speak, but please know that we want this 10 minutes to be rich and hopeful that you'll be able to engage and problem solve around some of the questions we pose. So as we think about moving in a direction towards equity, equity is not new. It's something that should be happening in classrooms across the state, across the nation. However, we know that there are historical inequities that have happened outside of even education related to, let's say, redlining or health inequities. But when we focus on education, our current Secretary of Education this summer used the following quote and the following comment. And I think it's important to highlight this. And I won't read it fully out for you, but he does indicate that our education system is not without fault in perpetuating systemic inequities, and that education itself is an institution that's rife with historic inequities in resourcing and discipline and opportunity. And he charges us that these structures must be dismantled. And as a leader in the education system, he's taking his frustration, his anger, and fueling it to a commitment to making sure those barriers are dismantled, to right those wrongs. And so he gives us this charge of that we're educators, and with that great responsibility, we are the change agents, and we're also community leaders. So I implore you to also think about your role as those change agents when we go through the remainder of the webinar. So the Pennsylvania definition of equity is as follows. Every student has access to the educational resources and rigor they need at the right moment in their education across all of these various categories. And I think when we highlight equity, it's important for us to consider that there's a concept called intersectionality. And that refers to the fact that many of us have multiple identities that make us who we are. And so that's why equity is so broad and also so very important, because you can have students who not only present as one of these categories, but also intersects with another one of these categories. So for instance, you may have a young person who identifies as Black, but also has learning disability and may also have gender identity decisions that they're in the process of making. And so all of those things intersect. And that's why equity is so important. Granted, we know you're not going to know every single nuance about every single student, but if those universal practices, when we think of MTSS, those universal practices address and are responsive to students that present with all of these various categories, we are doing true equity. So what is the field saying about equity in general? Currently, there's a lot being said. And even before COVID and the civil unrest that we have in our country, there was similar comments being said. However, Amira and I think it's important to highlight these so that you have a sense of how to maybe react or respond to some of the things that you see or hear. And so I know in my sessions, and I'm sure Amira can speak to this too, we've had folks from rural districts and even suburban districts who say, we don't have an issue. We don't have a racial problem, or we don't have racial diversity in our schools. So why do we need to do equity? When in reality, there are so many different students that exist in those settings that if you think back to that definition, you still have students with disabilities, you have students who are homeless, you have students who have low socioeconomic status. So equity still has a place. And I would argue that even if there isn't racial diversity, equitable practices show that it's important for students who don't have that diversity to still be exposed to people that are different from them in the content so that they can have that experience and not have culture shock when they are able to interact with people that are different from them. We also get requests like, our teachers need a 1 hour overview on equity. In no way does 1 hour in an overview give you what you need to engage on the journey. It may be a starting place, but it's not in depth enough for the journey to really take hold and have teeth. And so it becomes more of like a checkoff rather than a really long-term commitment. We hear also, this is just a new buzzword, it's overplayed. I'm sure you've heard it on numerous occasions, especially given the context now where there's some thought that talking about equity is a bad thing, or that talking about it too much insinuates that we really don't know what we're talking about, we're just kind of spouting. That is so far from the truth. Again, equity should be everything that we do for everyone sitting in those desks. We aren't doing equity, we're focused on trauma and mental health. That's that silo approach, feeling like, well, we're doing trauma this year and equity next year, when in reality, the umbrella for all of those practices is equitable practices. And so those things fit within the context of that umbrella. And the last one is one that we're hearing more frequently, but it's kind of disheartening. So equity is just Black Lives Matter and all lives matter. And we could spend a whole day training on just that one comment. But what it insinuates again is that when you say equity, you're leaning towards a certain way of thinking, instead of thinking about equity in the broad sense and how important it is to even have a dialogue and discussion about Black Lives Matter. I recently had someone reach out to me and say, I live in a rural setting and I support schools in that rural setting. And I just don't know if us talking about Black Lives Matter will resonate with that group of people. And my comment back to her was, with the equity work, you may not start with Black Lives Matter. You may start with the context that you're supporting. So she indicated that a lot of the students are low socioeconomic status. Okay, the conversation can begin there, but at no point should you neglect the Black Lives Matter commentary, the Black Lives Matter dialogue, because that's current events. And it's important for people to be able to understand and have that important dialogue around these concepts. So I just wanted to offer those for you to have an indication on how equity can be somewhat misunderstood. And Dr. Heather Bennett from the Pennsylvania School Boards Association, I would love for you to check out her website. If you go there, you can see that she indicates equity on a continuum, and we'll showcase a continuum as well. But one of the things she highlights is that a lot of districts are at the misunderstanding stage. And that's what you see kind of listed here in these quotes. So one thing to keep in mind is that people often ask for a framework around equity. And we think it's important in the context that we're describing now to highlight that equity implementation is multi-tiered systems of support. Dr. Amber Green from the University of Texas at Arlington highlighted this. And she indicated that if you look at the structure of a multi-tiered system of support, you can see our logo at the bottom, it's already tiered for the needs of the students. So think back to that definition of meeting students at that right moment. That right moment is within that tiered support system. And within that tiered support system, we're focusing on the whole child, academics, behavior, and social emotional learning. We're also doing some active problem solving in the arrows that you see in a circular motion, which provides equitable access to students. So why you're here is to learn about data-based decision-making. And one of the core cornerstones of the MTSS framework is just that, the importance of using data to make sure that the decisions that we're making are supporting the students in most need or addressing those students that are on the bubble and needing extra support. And how do we do that in that tiered framework? That's equity at its core, is ensuring universally there are clear practices in place, but that students that have varying levels of need are given what they need at that right moment. And so I'm excited to share that yesterday, the PDE Equitable Practices Hub was released. We'll put that link in the chat at some point today as well. But you'll notice that now we have a framework to help support the MTSS framework as well. And these are the equity pillars of practice. And they're as follows. What you don't see here is general equity practices, because that's a very broad understanding or concept. But when we drill down to the nuances, these are the pillars here: self-awareness, data practices, family and community engagement, academic equity, and disciplinary equity. And the focus of today's session will be on data practices. And it's so important to do that component of the equity journey, because that's the only way for us to really know whether or not we're having the impact that we're trying to address or trying to support. And so why use data to determine equity? The important key word here is to disaggregate. When we look at disaggregating, we're able to look at specific subgroups and know whether or not those subgroups are receiving the support that they need to be successful in our system. In addition to disaggregating, It's also important to calculate risk ratios and know the likelihood of those students or subgroups receiving a certain outcome. And that then helps us do root cause analysis to figure out what might be at the core, what might be causing some of these outcomes that we have within our locus of control to address. And just looking at some of these things, we can recognize disproportionate representation in, let's say, advanced placement courses or special education. We also could look at who is or who isn't present at, let's say, PTO or parent events. And these are all examples of how the schools can begin their journey to identify how well they're doing with equity or where they need to pick up some momentum. And what's important here is that these are disproportionality markers, and they essentially indicate symptomology or symptoms that might speak to some cultural mismatches that are present in the school. We may, again, think we're doing everything well, but we may have a group of families that really don't feel connected to our school. And if we don't take the time to address that, that particular group of people, students, families, community, may feel disenfranchised from the school system and continue to perpetuate the inequities that we see. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Amira.
Thanks, Nikole. So now we're going to go into our first breakout room. Now, Nikole just talked about disaggregating data, looking at root cause analysis and risk ratio. So we want to know, what is your experience in disaggregating data for subgroups? What are you guys doing in your buildings? Are you a part of that process, or is it something that you just get the data once it's already disaggregated? We want to know in the chat groups what you're doing in our breakout rooms, what you're doing, how involved are you, or how involved would you like to be? What would you do in a perfect world? So right now, Nikole's going to begin to put us in breakout groups, and I am going to stop recording as we go into the breakout rooms, and we'll begin recording when we return. Okay. Again, as we're coming back from the breakout rooms, if our note takers would take some time to populate the chat with just a summary of the discussions that you had in the breakout rooms, we'd like to highlight those. Someone commented, many are using Swiss, PBIS rewards, data system was mentioned, but doesn't seem to provide what schools are looking for. We had a wonderful group of school leaders and also tech. They're working through data, triangulation, and early warning system, which we like to hear. It is great that they are also looking at trends from prior years to inform priorities. That's really important, to look at that previous data to determine the work that is necessary moving forward. Great. Oh, wow, someone mentioned the question, who's not at the table, is a powerful opener. And we'll be talking more about that in a little while. Some had minimal experience looking at subgroups at this point, and that's okay. We hope to give you some information to take back to your IUs or your school districts to inform data review as you move forward. Someone said our team was made up of regional consultants, PaTTAN consultants, and our district principal. The principal shared that they are just beginning this journey of PBIS and academic MTSS, and are going to start working on looking at subgroups. In addition, ATTAC, working with English language learners, is really analyzing access to programming. Very good to look at those specific subgroups, and those are the groups of students who are marginalized and typically don't always have access to all the resources. So looking at them and determining what their specific needs are is really important. PA Future Ready Schools, the conversations are our work. Great. Identifying that they are at self-awareness and having the difficult conversations around root causes. Yes, very, very important to start there and determine where we are, who we see ourselves as, what are our biases, our perceptions, our beliefs, and how does that impact how we educate students, and really how those things and that how self-awareness can lead to understanding where the root causes are for students who are marginalized. It's very important. The importance of looking at data to determine if there is any disproportionality of groups of students referred to special education, identified as having educational disability of emotional disturbance, chapter 15 for OHI. We're not doing enough with data. We use it, but we don't take it to the next step. Data doesn't lie, but can be skewed to look different. Data tends to focus on the special education genre, and race is not typically talked about. There's definitely a fear factor about bringing up race. Yes, it's always that purple elephant in the room, right? We know that race is an issue. We know that it leads, that it's one of those factors that impacts disproportionality, but we don't discuss it. And I think if we're really going to be responsive to all students, we definitely need to look at those root causes. And even if we feel that we don't have the tools to support this work, bring in consultants, contact us at PaTTAN, and get someone at the table to support that work so that students are getting what they need and not really being fearful of what the result may be, because we know that children's lives are at stake. And so as adults, we want to make sure that we're doing the best thing for children. And so having that fear is fine, and being uncomfortable is fine, but we do need to take those next steps, so that's important. At beginning stages of looking at data, but struggling with adequate resources to support what is needed after looking at data. Just started PBIS and SWIS last year, work in progress. Great. So hopefully the resources that we're providing and the resources that will be available in the Google Drive will be tools that you can utilize as you continue this process. And this is the last one that I'll read, but please keep populating them. Conversations have been hard. They're very willing listeners, but also push back on these families, these kids, even when districts are forced to look at inequities in their system. Data has been skewed, referrals stop, rather than the underlying issues addressed. Yes, so it's like, okay, we're not putting any more kids into special ed. We're not putting them in special ed, but what are we doing to support them, and how are we addressing those underlying issues? So yes, I've seen that before as well. In addition, Silky was hoping to share a calculator developed from the Florida teams. Okay, so any resources that folks have, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and just continue to look at the chat box to get information. Someone just put in the thought exchange, and I'm not familiar with it, but feel free to take any of those resources that are in the chat box and continue to populate any thoughts that you're having, and everyone will have access to see them. Thank you so much for your willingness to share those conversations, and hopefully what we'll do over the course of the year will be beneficial in the conversations you're having around supporting students as you move forward with being more equitable and implementing equitable practices. All right, Nikole, so we'll move to the next slide. All right, so we talked about disaggregating data, looking at those, the symptoms, if you will, of disproportionality, what happens with that data. But we want to look at what contributes to disproportionality. And we'll go to the next slide. So here you have a diagram that shows why disproportionality is so complex, because there's so many factors that influence disproportionality, and there isn't just one thing. In fact, this list isn't even inclusive of all the things that can impact disproportionality in a school district. And so when we consider the different factors that are the components of supporting disproportionality, we want to make sure that we're considerate in addressing each of those factors. And it can start with looking at interventions that are in place or the lack of interventions to support students. What educational opportunities are available for students? How do we empower families in the community and utilize those rich resources to support students? Additionally, teacher expectations and misconceptions, this idea of cultural dissonance, those mismatches of what students bring to the school, what school culture is, and even what teachers are bringing to the school. Socio-demographics, those mismatches and understandings of who students are, where they come from, what their community is like, and that mismatch from what teachers are expecting or what teachers experience in their own communities is key to identifying how we combat disproportionality and really supporting students in providing what they need. Also, when we consider instruction and assessment, are we being culturally responsive? Are we being culturally relevant? Are we including that pedagogy in how we educate students and how we assess them? Do we have multiple modes of assessment for students who need that? And then those discipline practices and policies that are in place. Some, by not even realizing it, are disproportionately impacting students of a specific group. And so really looking at that data will get you to what the issues are, what those symptoms are, and then it takes you back to these components and it allows you to combat these issues individually. And obviously you're not going to be able to attack all of these issues at once, but having that data available and developing a plan to dismantle those systems that are in place that disproportionately negatively impact certain groups of students is the best way to do it. So utilizing that data to develop that plan and move forward is really the way that we have to go to make sure that students are getting what they need and they're not being treated differently than the majority students in a school building. And so it definitely isn't something that will happen all at once. And it's not something that even can happen over the course of a year. But I think with putting in place an action plan and continually evolving that action plan as you understand your data, as you determine where the issues are and how to support them and what resources you're putting in place to support students, that's really how you get to the finish line. And it will take some time. So sometimes we'll see people who want that kind of one and done, check off the box and we're on to the next topic. And that's just not the way to do this work. It's a marathon and it's ongoing. And some of these changes we may not even see in our lifetimes, and that's okay. But as long as we're on the road, that's the important thing. Right, Nikole?
Okay, so we've talked about disproportionality, we've talked about how to disaggregate data, and one of the things Amira just highlighted was the importance of being culturally responsive and culturally relevant. And so just for a brief moment, I'm going to ground us in how we can understand that as it relates to our specific context. As I always say, in education, we have to have a shape or a diagram of some kind to illustrate what it is that we're trying to convey, and this is no different. So what you see are the circles that represent people, policies, and practices. And the way that we can be culturally relevant and responsive through an equitable lens is to focus on these three big pillars. People being the folks that are sitting in the desk, the folks that are standing in front of the classroom, those that are administrators in schools, as well as families and communities represent the people. People drive policy. And in that driving of policy, we are able to make changes because then policies drive the practices that we want to see implemented in our systems. So for instance, when we think of the transgender community, and there's still a lot of fight and things that are happening in that community to get rights for people that identify as transgender. So people that represent the transgender community said, we need access to certain restrooms or certain locker rooms. They then informed policy. And so in schools across the nation, those policies have been adopted to address practices to ensure that folks that identify as transgender have a safe and responsive system that they sit in. So that's just one example of how people influences policies, and policy then is the execution of those policies in the form of practice. What I would like to say here is that you see another wheel that simply illustrates how equitable practices can be done through a lens. Oftentimes, and I often reference Dr. Jennifer Collins, who is our MTSS statewide lead, she talks about the importance of having the coalition of the willing. And that coalition of the willing are the folks that are charged up and they want to see something change in their system. And they have a desire, as you see the will, the desire to lead. That's the yellow part at the top. What often happens is that we move quickly from will all the way to green with skill. And so at the time when we thought about that, it made sense. but there was a missing component. And the Wisconsin RTI Center put out this graphic that I think nicely articulates what it is we should do when we want to explain or understand cultural humility. And that's that willingness to learn about people and to learn about their cultures and their backgrounds and be able to accept and also be willing to understand. And so what you see here is moving from the desire to lead, the will part, and adding a piece called fill. And the fill part is where you gain that cultural knowledge that I just highlighted. So we're believing that all students will learn. We understand that there are unique identities. We know our communities. That piece is so crucial because if we don't have that piece, it's impossible to provide equity in action. And that's the skill component, which is applying the knowledge that you now have and using those practices in curriculum, accepting instructional responsibility, and then leading, modeling, and advocating for equity practices. At the core of that wheel is equity and culturally responsive practice. And for both Amira and I, we feel like this graphic really depicts where it is folks need to be if they want to engage on this journey to really see systemic change happen. So we wanted to ground you in some of these concepts before we move into how we look at data through an equitable lens, because we think that these will help us to have a framework or an understanding moving forward. And so this slide just essentially captures what was highlighted. And I go back to Amira's point, which is highlighted on the left, that being culturally responsive is a journey and it's not a final destination. It's moving at the pace of the most marginalized. Dr. Erica McDowell from School District of Philadelphia recently said that, and it's resonated with me because often what we see is this tension between equity and efficiency. Dina Simmons is another really great researcher around equity, and she uses that phrase because she says oftentimes we're so concerned with moving fast and getting it done, checking off that box, that we're not really being equitable, because if we were, we would be taking the time that's necessary to ensure that we're addressing the needs of the students that we see through that will, fill, and skill. So that tension is something that we have to start to address. And when we're sitting in data team meetings, that's where sometimes it's most manifested. So that's what we hope to, Amira and I hope to accomplish today, is to give you some tools as you're sitting in those data team meetings, whether you're facilitating a team, a member of a team, an administrator supporting a team. How can you make your teams that evaluate your system's data more equitable? And so one of the things that's important is this concept of knowing who you are. And we like to say, we look at the invisible backpack or the invisible briefcase, because as someone highlighted in the chat, self-awareness is one of those things that cannot be ignored. It's one of those key pillars that has to happen first in order for the journey to begin. So one of the things that's built into your backpack or your briefcase is the concept of bias, privilege, and power. All of us hold those things, but some of us have different degrees of these things depending on who we are. So one of the things that I want to highlight is the concept of white privilege. This is a term and a topic that often raises some anxiety. It also bridges some defensiveness. What I would say, and Amira, feel free to jump in because she does this part amazingly, is to say that white privilege is not an individual privilege. White privilege and other privileges are societal privileges that afford people opportunities, whether earned or not. It's not to say that white people, Black people, rich people haven't struggled or have had to go through different things to get where they are. That would be more of an individual focus. And our focus when we talk about privilege in our backpacks is that societal concept. So one of the examples Amira often gives is if we were to go to one of our local drugstores, for instance, and we need flesh tone Band-Aids. What is the flesh tone color that's most represented? That's privilege sort of manifested in the sense that if Amira or I went to purchase those Band-Aids, flesh tone may not look like flesh tone on our skin. So that's one example. Another example would be when we talk about food and we go to a grocery store, and everyone, American cuisine is throughout the grocery store. But if we want cuisine that's ethnic, it's dedicated to one specific aisle, quote unquote ethnic. So those are things that are privileges that are societal, that are manifested in society. And so if we don't have an understanding of those privileges, those power dynamics, the things that we don't often think about that impact how we view data, how we take in data, our biases, it's hard to really look at data through an equitable lens. So I'm going to pause there and just see if Amira has anything to add to that.
I think you did a great job, Nikole. We'll definitely talk more about this as we move through the next sessions. And so we'll have time to highlight it, unpack it, and then give you guys a chance to talk about it. Thank you, Nikole.
Sure, thank you. Okay, so as we move on, we think it's important to, again, think about where we sit when we think about equality versus equity, and that continuum that we know exists for everyone. We all exist on a continuum in some form or fashion. And as Amira said, in our second session coming up in November, we'll be able to dive much deeper into that self-awareness component, but we wanted to give you a taste of it here because it impacts how you view data. So the graphic that you see at the bottom is a continuum that I'll highlight in a little bit more depth. But one thing that you'll notice is that at the top in red, it says downward spiral conversation. And at the bottom in green, it says upward spiral conversation. And so as we're sitting around talking about data, it's very easy to fall into the trap of a downward spiral conversation. And those downward spiral conversations essentially are those things that lay blame to families, to students, to things that are outside of the school's locus of control. Whereas upward spiral conversations focus on what it is we do have control over, how we can start to analyze root cause, etc. And again, we're going to do a little bit of a dive around how to unpack those spiral conversations in the context of the continuum. And so what I'd like to do is briefly take you through the continuum, which, as we said, we're going to do a deeper dive in the November session, but we wanted to introduce it today. So what often happens is that we start at the bottom with cultural destructiveness. And what I'd like for you to do as I go through this continuum is think about not only yourselves on this continuum, but also think about your system. So if you are in a school, if you are a IU consultant, a PaTTAN consultant, an administrator, consider your system as we go through this continuum. So this first part is called cultural destructiveness. Again, context is key here. Culture is not solely referring to race. Culture refers to a number of different groups that may exist in the context of your specific system. So cultural destructiveness is seeking to eliminate the cultures of others in all aspects. So what that can translate into would be, our scores would be better if we didn't have the special education students in our classes, or if they were in a different school. It's the thought of removing a group of people so that we could have better outcomes, or that things could be better for us. As we move up the continuum, we're now at what's called cultural incapacity, and that is trivializing and stereotyping other cultures. So the example I often give here would be if, let's say, the administration team of a district has changed and a new superintendent has been brought in, he's brought in his own new cabinet, and in that, he may be a Latino male. He may have brought along other folks that represent his culture. Someone who's been in the district for a while may make the comment, it's mighty Latino at the top, trivializing and stereotyping the fact that there's change. So this happens quite often. Think about your systems. Think about the comments that you hear, and if you've had any of these experiences. The next one, which is another one that we'll spend a great deal of time on when we talk in November, is this concept of blindness, cultural blindness, color blindness, etc. Essentially, it says that it's not noticing or acknowledging the culture of others and ignoring discrepant experiences. And I like that last part because, again, we'll highlight blindness in some categories next time. But what you often see is, I don't see color, I see you for who you are, I don't see your disability. On a systems level, it might be people saying, we don't have a problem with race here. We don't have issues here. Our employees are happy. blindness, not really knowing whether or not certain groups of people that exist in that system do feel connected to that system. As we start to move up, we get to what's called pre-competence. And this is increasing awareness, either moving in a constructive direction or faltering and stopping. And I have to be honest with you, in the sites that I've been supporting recently, there is this tension of moving from blindness to pre-competence. And at that pre-competence space, there is the likelihood that it could all just crash and burn. And that is where that will, feel, and skill is really important, because if you get in a situation where, and we've heard it in the chat, there's resistance or an unwillingness, or the approach wasn't exactly what it needed to be, all of your work could go away because either there's no buy-in or you as the person who's so willing gets burnt out quickly. Pre-competence has that ability to happen, either movement in a good way or stopping. We then move into cultural competence. And this is where you're aligning your personal values to be inclusive of other cultures that are new or different, and there's healthy interactions. And that's what we would want to see in most systems, and especially in our schools. And again, that takes time, that takes movement up the continuum. Some of you may say, oh, our system is already there. Kudos. There are a lot of systems that are really struggling to get there. So if your system, as you see it, is at the competence stage, we want to know what you're doing, because those are things that are impacting not only students, but also staff and also families and communities. And at the pinnacle of the continuum is what's called the cultural proficiency, I would say utopia. And that's holding the vision for creating a socially just democracy, lifelong learning to serve all. When we think about things like the Danielson framework, we know that no one lives at distinguished. There's always room to grow. I would argue that in this same case, no one lives at proficiency 24/7. There's always room to grow. There's always new situations that come up, but the goal overall is to obtain some form of proficiency. And that's why you see the arrow on the left that indicates movement up and down, because depending on the situation, you yourself might move up and down, but also your system, if there's a change in structure, if there's a change in administration, might move up and down as well. And so what do upward spiral conversations look like? These highlight the last 3 points, that pre-competence, competence, and proficiency, where you're growing cultural competence, and this is in the form of those policies and practices, and there's ongoing reflection and assessment. So in data team meetings, again, when you're sitting down looking at data, are you engaging in those upward spiral conversations that really lead to outcomes that you want to see or practices that you want to see change? On the flip side, what we often see are downward spiral conversations, and they tend to, again, be blaming others. Usually it's about them, someone put it in the chat, or those kids, how they need to change, how to eradicate those cultural attributes. So let's think about that for a moment. If they didn't wear hoodies, or if we changed the dress code, maybe they would be better. Maybe their behavior would improve. Those are things that might be removing cultural attributes from young people that we have that represent who they are. There are a lot of policies in our country that focus on hair, and that at its core is inherently systemic racism. Simply because a student's hair looks a certain way, we now punish because of that. And that might have a cultural context to think about. Downward spiral conversations lead to those types of policies being enacted. And now I'm going to turn it over to Amira to do the chat break.
Okay, thanks, Nikole. So instead of going into breakout rooms, we're just going to poll you guys, and we want you to put your responses in the chat box. So consider on a scale of 1 to 5, when you hear one of those downward spiraling conversations, maybe you were a part of the conversation and it starts to take a downward spiral, or you're in passing, you hear something. How comfortable would you feel responding to others if they're making negative statements about different groups of people or individuals based on their ethnicity, their gender, their race, their ability level, religion, sexual orientation, or even their gender identity? How comfortable do you feel? And so folks are filling in the chat box, and we see a lot of folks who are at 4s, we see some 3s, see 5s. 2 to 3, see some 2s, 3 depending on the situation. So see lots of 4s just in scanning it. So we feel that most folks feel pretty comfortable disrupting those conversations. And that's so important, especially in the school environment when we hear adults talking about children. Sadly, this is a comment, and I'm going to just share it because it's typed in. Sadly, I think my comfort level depends on the context of the conversation. I would likely say 4 or 5, depending on the situation. And that's good. We want you to be honest. We want you to speak your truth. And this is a judgment-free zone, so don't feel like you have to apologize for being honest about where you are. And some other people say it just varies. And relationship is so important. And we're going to talk about that because dismantling these systems of oppression, it doesn't just occur at work. It also occurs in your personal life. So it's not just to be on board with being equitable at work and then you take off your equity champion hat when you get home. It's all the time. And I think that's what makes it so difficult, and that's what makes it uncomfortable, because sure, when you're talking to your colleagues, you may say some things, but what about you're talking to your mom or your uncle, or that everyone has folks who have opposing views in their family. And so you're at the family reunion, you're at the barbecue, and you're the one who's championing not saying certain words or things, that stereotypes that have existed and been accepted in your family or in your community for a long time. Now you're challenging those. No one wants to be ostracized in that way. So it really takes that person who's strong and standing up for folks who are marginalized, who are seen as other, and using their voice. And I think that allyship is so very important, using your privilege, right? Using your power to speak truth to those things that that tend to minimize other groups. And so when you see people say it's about relationship, it definitely is, because you can say something to your colleagues, but your uncle who believes a certain way and everyone knows that that's just the way he is. But when you start to challenge those people and their thinking, it's a different story. And I think it gives you that strength to really move forward with it even more at work. If you're doing it at home and you're doing it in your community, doing it in school and doing it with your colleagues, is just another piece of that. So thank you for those comments. One more I'll read. I'm sorry, Nikole. I find it challenging. I find it challenging to handle it in larger group discussions at school when I want to address the comment, but also strengthen relationships with colleagues. It can be hard to do both at the same time, and it's a conflict. And sometimes it does feel like conflict. And maybe in a group setting, you don't say it in front of everyone, but you take that person to the side and say, hey, I heard when you said this, and this is actually not true, or you address it. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the next few slides. So Nikole, we can kind of scoot to the next one. No, this one is good. So basic strategies to respond to downward spirals. And these 4 opportunities come from teaching tolerance, and they do have pocket cards that you can download from Teaching Tolerance. I can share that in the chat, but it's really an opportunity to speak up at school or in your community and respond to everyday stereotypes and biases. And you really want to ground yourself and plant yourself as being a person who is willing to stand up against what's wrong, stand up against, speak out against people saying inappropriate things and using stereotypes and biases as facts when they're talking about specific groups of people. And when we look at interrupting, we really want to speak up against biased remarks every time it happens, not just sometimes. And again, you may not do it in the full group, but you take that person to the side. So you interrupt it. And you want to do it without exception. And it's really important to do it in the moment. Obviously, you don't want to embarrass people, and you don't want to risk ruining relationships, but it's important to interrupt bias and stereotypes. And you want to question. So you ask simple exploratory questions when you hear a comment. And that can be really powerful because sometimes people just say things and they don't even think about why they're saying them. Why did you say that? Well, what do you mean? Tell me more. And I use that all the time, tell me more. And I got to tell you, when I hear people say things and very ableist kind of comments, and I'll say, tell me more about that. When people start to hear themselves talk about why they said a thing, they really kind of feel silly and they're like, wait a minute, okay, yeah, no, I really mean it like that. Okay, now I see what you're saying. So it can be something very simple and it's not accusatory, but you want to get to the root cause of why someone has come to a particular conclusion. Education is important. And so when people use hateful language, or it's not necessarily that they are a hateful person, but sometimes they're really ignorant and they lack exposure to diverse populations. And I think it's important that Nikole noted, even if you have a homogenous group in your school, it's important that everyone's exposed to all kinds of people, because those cultural dissonance issues occur when I only know my culture, or I understand that my culture is the only culture, and that's just not true. When we consider America, sometimes you hear people refer to it as a melting pot, and I totally disagree. America should be a tossed salad so that each of the different flavors are highlighted and they're special in their own unique way. And education is an important way of getting to that point. And then echoing, it's really powerful to be that first person who interrupts bias, who interrupts that stereotype. But it's also, if you hear someone saying, hey, I didn't really think that was cool, or really that wasn't the right thing to say, or that's actually not true about that group, but the people who echo it. So not only that first person, but that second, third, fourth, fifth person, because in order to interrupt it, in order to eliminate these downward spiraling conversations, it needs to be reiterated. We need to hear it over and over again. This isn't the right thing. And I think in this current climate in our country, we see people posting things on social media. We see things on the news. It's important to hear and see these messages everywhere we go so that we're interrupting it, we're eliminating it. And eventually the systems that are in place to make the biases okay, to make the systems of oppression okay, those start to go away as well. So it's important that everyone's on the same page, and it's okay to say, hey, yeah, no, I disagree with that, and not in a demeaning manner, not to make anyone feel badly, because maybe that's all they've ever known. And that's okay too, but we need to educate them. And I'm ready for the next slide.
Okay, so I think, Amira, if you're okay, why don't we take our break? So we'll take our break. It's about 10:12. So if you could come back at 10:30, we'll resume talking about how you can integrate cultural proficiency using the data process. So excited that you've stayed with us. The chat is really good right now. Keep those chats coming and we'll continue to populate resources. We'll see you back here at 10:30. Back, everyone. We're excited that you have returned from break and hoping that you will hang in there with us for the remaining slides that we want to take you through. We're hoping that the beginning portion of the session has been super helpful. What we're seeing in the chat is a lot of positive responses and a lot of good questions. And we're hoping that throughout the series, we'll continue to have some really intense and relevant dialogue. One of the things that I put in the chat just recently, if you want to take a look, is again a connection to the PDE Equitable Practices Hub. And so I thought, as a way of maybe prep work before you come into the November session, one of the key pillars that we're going to touch on next time we meet is self-awareness. And so if you were to visit the hub and go to the self-awareness tab, you can look at that topic through either the lens of a district school, a classroom, or individual. And I would just highly encourage you to engage as much as you can in that hub and sharing the hub out with any user that you think would benefit from the resources that are populated there. So just wanted to give you a heads up that that might be some good front loading before you engage in our session in November. So thank you for that. What we're going to do now is go into how do we evaluate data through an equitable lens. And I think in the beginning portion of the session, Amira and I both hope that we gave some really foundational understanding as to how we can approach this work. But now when we're sitting at those tables and those meetings, what do we do with the data that we have in front of us? And so one of the people that is really important to this work is Nancy Love. And I would encourage you to simply Google her name, and a book will come up from her, and it's about using data, the using data process. She focuses on what's called collaborative inquiry. And I'm going to highlight that in a moment. But what I want to take us through are the stages of her using data process. And over on the left-hand side are the stages. And then on the right are the specific ways that you can integrate cultural proficiency. So think back to that continuum that I highlighted earlier, where cultural proficiency was sort of the utopia, the panacea of where we want to be. How we get there and how we integrate is indicated on the right side of the table. So the first part, or the first stage, is what's called building the foundation. And so at its core, it's doing what Amira and I did at the beginning. It's laying groundwork. It's ensuring that everyone is kind of on the same page and understanding and knowing how we'll proceed as a collective when we address data and analyze the data. So the ways to integrate cultural proficiency are just a few examples noted here. It's learning about the continuum that we highlighted and the principles associated with it. We didn't go into depth on those principles, but that's something we'll do in other sessions. But those guiding principles around cultural competency and cultural proficiency really drive how you address cultural proficiency in your practice. It's also important to establish group norms. I would refrain from norms and say agreements for talking about race and ethnicity, class, and culture. Again, these conversations are really intense sometimes, and so we need some grounding around how we'll interact. And incorporating cultural proficiency into the vision of the school or program. When Amira and I go out and support districts, one of the key questions we ask before we even jump right in is, what is your current understanding of equity? And also, what is your vision for equity? And a lot of districts have a very, and I hate to use this term, but a cliche vision. We want all students to succeed, things like that, but they haven't really articulated or taken a deep dive into what that means when you operationalize that mission and vision. So it's important to be clear on what it is you want to see happen as a result of being equitable. As we move into the next stage, that's focusing on identifying a student learning problem. Now, in the context of MTSS, we know from a tiered support system, universally, we're looking at the universal collective of students. As we move up the tiers, we may begin to get more in depth on specific students or student groups. And so I just want you to have that context in mind as I'm going through this section. What's important to do is to examine the disaggregated data. We highlighted why that's important, and also understand and recognize when we're in the midst of an upward versus downward spiral conversation. In addition to that, it's looking at the gaps that might achieve between the learning problem and ensuring that we're closing them with a very explicit goal. So not just saying, we want our African-American boys to score higher on the math PSSA. That doesn't give me anything measurable. It doesn't show me how we're going to address that. We're, again, putting some blame on that group of students. As we move down into the process, we now get into verifying causes, and this essentially can speak to root cause analysis. So you want to engage in dialogue about what assumptions may be generating some of the causes that we see. So in behavior, a lot of the times when we look at systems like Swiss, which you guys have said a lot of you are using, you may be able to deep dive and see at the root, what are the behaviors that students of certain backgrounds are being referred for? And in a lot of cases, Dr. Kent McIntosh from the University of Oregon would say that students of color, students with disabilities, the ones that are typically disproportionate in discipline are oftentimes receiving what he calls the 3 Ds of subjective behavior. And they are disrespect, defiance, and disruption. Those 3 Ds are different depending on who the teacher, the staff member, the administrator might be. And so with that, we have to know how bias or backgrounds, backpacks, and briefcases impact our decision-making around the data that we see. And so that's why it's so important to be able to uncover what assumptions might be at the root. In addition to that, testing assumptions about those causes with research and local data is really important to support practice. And then it's that fill part of that circle we talked about, learning about cultures. Families are a great resource. Learning about how behaviors are acceptable at home, but may not be acceptable at school, and how can we bridge the two? How can we understand more there? And this is important before we jump to conclusions and make rash decisions around the data that we're reviewing. Okay, so the next two stages are here. The first one is generating solutions. So reflecting on the cultural proficiency of solutions generating by asking the following questions, and I'm going to read this out. Do our strategies address student populations most in need of our attention? So as I mentioned, Dr. McDowell said, are we moving at the pace of the most marginalized? Are we addressing the populations that desperately need our support? Or are we just kind of putting a blind eye and not uncovering what we need to address? Once we know that, are they likely to result in closing the achievement gap? Some would argue it would be important to say the opportunity gap. Are students able to have opportunity and access to even try to close the gap? Do any of these strategies harm or neglect any student or group of students or teachers? Important. The staff members are just as important. So we have to, when we're facilitating these conversations, consider not only the student outcomes, but also our staff members and how are we supporting them in this effort. As Amira pointed out, and I love when she said it, some people are just ignorant. Some people don't have a clue that what they're doing may be damaging to young people or to others around them. And how do we empower them to be able to learn more and feel comfortable enough to want to learn more? And so these are conversations that have to happen in order for change to occur. And would students and their parents in our school agree with the solutions that we put in place? So very important. We may think it's the best solution ever, but our families and students may think it's the worst. And if that's the case, we can't blame them when the solutions don't work. So all of these questions are really imperative. And in a moment, Amira and I are going to take you through a decision-making tool guide that kind of puts these questions in a similar context, but is nicely outlined in a map that you'll be able to kind of have at your disposal as a quick guide as you're engaging in these conversations. And lastly, implementing, monitoring, and achieving results. So looking back at the data again and seeing, have we made an impact? Have we seen change occur? And acknowledging those individuals whose practices have changed and become more culturally proficient or culturally relevant. When we think about, and I'll use PBIS again, when we think about PBIS as a framework and how we catch students being good, the same thing could apply here. If we see staff members who are trying new practices and have had success in those practices, utilize them, acknowledge them, ask them to model some of those practices for the rest of the school or for the rest of their grade level team. That's a way of achieving results and sustaining those results across time. And so one of the things that I like to highlight here again also comes from Nancy Love's book. And I love this graphic because for many of us, when we think about professional development, and just like you're all sitting here, how does this content translate into practice? And what we know to be true is that a spray and pray often does not result in much change at all. What often happens is the need for the content to be then implemented with coaching alongside of it, so that the people that are taking in the content can begin to apply it, have difficulty, run into barriers, and have that coach to help them navigate those barriers and learn how to become more resilient in the practice. And so what you see here is data on the one side of the bridge, professional development being embedded, but the only way that we can get to results is through the cornerstones or the bedrock, I would say, of the bridge that you see holding up collaborative inquiry. And what I would like to do is just read you some of the questions that data teams need to engage in as they cross this bridge. First off, how are we doing? Second, what are we doing well? How can we amplify our successes? Who isn't learning? Who aren't we serving? What aren't they learning? What in our practice could be causing that? And how can we be sure? What can we do to improve? How do we know if it worked? And what do we do if the students don't learn in the way that we're providing the content? So the goal is to shift from traditional data practices towards high-performing data culture. And it's being able to look at that data through a lens that allows us to ask those probing questions so that we can achieve equitable results. And what I love about the very bottom of that bridge is that without school culture, trust, and equity, that bridge can't stand. Even with leadership, collaboration, frequent data, and instructional improvement, improvement for who? That's the key question. Without that bottom part, it's impossible to know whether or not all of our students are receiving and responding to what we're providing through the data we're reviewing. Okay, so this is the tool that we want to give you some orientation around. And if you go to the Google Drive, which holds the materials, you should see a copy in PDF format of this tool that comes from the Austin Independent School District. And it focuses on decision-making, essentially at level 1. And so it's a map. It takes you through 4 steps, literally 4 steps in those key questions that I just addressed earlier with the bridge. So at
Nikole,
this point,
I'm sorry, the questions that you addressed with the bridge, is it possible to put those in the chat?
Absolutely. So Amira, while you take number 1,
yes,
I'll go ahead and put those in the chat.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Next slide. Here we go.
Right. All right. So the first step in that decision-making process is considering who's at the decision-making table. And so some of the questions you want to consider is like, who's the team made up of? Are diverse people and perspectives represented with power and agency? Is it safe to disagree, or do we have yes men at the table? Who is silenced or muted or ignored? Whose opinion really doesn't matter? Whose voice is not heard? Some groups of people, they may say things and they may be that other group or the marginalized group, and sometimes their voice isn't really heard at the table. What cultures and ways of communicating are dominant and valued? How are their norms set up, or are there opportunities for consideration, and is everyone's voice taken into consideration when you have your group established at the table? And so Nicole's going to go to the next slide for me. So typically your MTSS team is made up of those teachers, the general ed, special ed, typically the leaders, someone from each grade group, instructional and behavioral coaches. You have a school psychologist, your school counselor, your EL teacher, principal, assistant principal, and other. Like, who's missing? Are we including families in those conversations? Do we have someone representative from the community at the table? That piece, that voice could be what you're missing when you're making decisions and you consider the decisions that are being made, you're implementing your plan, and then you find that your results you haven't been effective. That other person or group of people who are missing could be that dynamic that you need to get the results that you're looking to achieve. And Nikole, if you want to go to the next slide. So when we consider including families and community in the MTSS process, how do we engage them? How do we empower them so that it's not like the experts only approach? Oftentimes when you consider if you're a special education professional and you're in those IEP meetings, parents are really silent because the school team is talking and they're sharing, unless they have an advocate with them. Sometimes they don't always, depending on the family, they don't feel comfortable to share, and they are the subject matter experts on their children. And so we want to make sure that we are empowering them to be a part of the process. And I worked on a couple of professional development grants, and in one of them, we had to include in our data team makeup a family member or a parent. And the teams questioned, how do I include families, especially if we're looking at student data? Well, we know that it's essential to have family voice in these meetings. And we want to attempt to involve them in a manner that they feel comfortable with. So in the grants that I'm working on, we have the team family member included, but what we do is we include them in on general topics, not necessarily student-specific data, but any general conversation about policies, practices, interventions, assessments, anything that's not using student names, any systemic data, we can include them in the conversation. And that feedback that they provide is usually pretty powerful. We were meeting in person, but now that you're meeting over Zoom, it makes it even more accessible for families to participate. They come on at the beginning, or you have them come on at the end, where you're talking about that general information, those systemic things that impact everyone. They provide their input, and then they can drop off the call once you start to talk about student-specific data. But oftentimes we consider it difficult to include the family and not really understanding how, but it's important to figure out how, because that voice can be that missing piece that you need to get the results that you need for those students who aren't achieving how they should be, or how meeting the expectations that you have. And having that voice at the table, or those voices at the table to give you that additional insight, can be crucial. Nikole?
Absolutely. So one of the other examples that I would offer too, Amira, is in the PBIS side of the street. When we talk about how to engage families, oftentimes, and I think Christine just put it in the chat, oftentimes there's a reluctance or a resistance to share some of that information. So for instance, behavioral data, suspension data, expulsion data, schools get very protective of that data, and they're concerned about sharing it with families and communities for fear of either being seen in a negative light, or fear that they're going to be accused of something. And so what we say in PBIS world is to really still engage them, but be clear on what it is that you're going to showcase when families are present. So it doesn't mean that families and community members have to be at every monthly meeting. It just means that there will be specific meetings throughout the year where families will be invited. They'll be given an overview of maybe what the data is showing, and then ask them for that input that Amira so nicely said. It's important for their input, because otherwise the change won't happen that you want to see. So just wanted to offer that additional example regarding families. And that takes us to step 2. So step 1, we now need to figure out who is there. Step 2, what problems are we trying to solve, for whom and by when? So these questions should look kind of familiar based on the questions that I put in the chat and also covered connected to the bridge. So essentially it's identifying the groups who are predictably or systemically oppressed by current policies and practices. And what I love about this next part is the centralization, centralizing the lived experiences, strengths, and needs of students and staff from underserved communities. And oftentimes, when we look at problems or we look at issues, we look at it from a very global lens. And that's the importance of disaggregating data, because when you start to drill down and look at subgroups, you start to see that maybe those outcomes are not the same as what we thought when we looked at it from a global spot. So with that, then we need to know, what are we trying to solve around those particular subgroups? What are we trying to change? And are we trying to change them to be more like the dominant group? Or are we trying to address our system to become more responsive to the subgroups that are not being responded to well? So it's important for us to take inventory of who are we best serving, who are we not serving so well, and how can we make sure that the problems we're trying to address are legitimate problems that we can fully address without hopefully disengaging or disenchanting the students further from where they feel they belong in the system. And so step 3 then takes in, does this solution actually work for the most marginalized and vulnerable students and staff? And we won't know unless we ask. And that goes back to Amira's point about the importance of engaging families and students in these processes when we're problem solving around data. And so again, we often make decisions from a place of power and privilege, and it's important to think about how we could ensure that our power and privilege is used for good instead of just remaining a benefit for just the dominant group. And what's interesting is that conscious leaders, they meaningfully communicate this with the most marginalized people and those who are most adversely affected. And so that key communication loop is important as we're going through this data-based decision-making process. So who do we have at the decision-making table? What problems are we trying to solve? And when we come up with solutions, are those solutions actually making the difference that we want to see with the group that we were supposed to be supporting the most? And I'll turn it to Amira for step 4.
Thanks, Nikole. So step 1, we're considering who's at the table. Step 2, we look at the problem that we want to solve. Step 3, does the solution actually work? Now we move to step 4. What are the plans for ongoing data collection, analysis, and publicizing progress results and course corrections during and after the decision? And so this is I think this is the evaluation piece of it, because you want to see the results of how you've implemented your plan. And now that you know what you've done and you're getting the feedback on the plan that you put in place, how do you evaluate it? So you want to evaluate the implementation process of the plan that you put in place. Did you do what you said you were going to do? And were things implemented as planned? Were there adaptations made? Do you need to make additional adaptations? Were all the steps taken when the tasks were completed? And were pretty much was there fidelity with the implementation of your plan? You want to consider cultural competence and sustainability principles. Are they integrated in the activities that were put forth? And if not, how do you do those things moving forward? And you want to make sure that you're sharing this information to get feedback. Someone put in the chat box, and it's not a direct quote, but our families are the stakeholders. So are you getting feedback from those stakeholders? When you're evaluating, you want to answer the questions of, are the resources sufficient that you put in place? Do you have appropriate interventions? Are you meeting the needs for those students? What obstacles were in place? How did you address the obstacles? Did you address them? What can you do to move forward to eliminate those obstacles and barriers that may occur? And who's participating? Where are you seeing issues with staff or leadership? Is everyone on board? And if they're not on board, how do you get that support? How do you move forward with that? And so you want to take a global look at practices, policies that have been put in place, interventions that are there, that aren't there, and really determine if what you've done is effective and get that feedback from stakeholders and others who can see your policies and practices and determine what changes need to be made moving forward. How do you adjust that plan and move forward to support that issue and resolve that problem that you identified in step 2? And step 1, going back to step 1, do you need to reevaluate who's at the table? Again, has that changed? Were their voices heard? Were there things that were missed? So really continuously going through that process and addressing those steps to ensure that you're solving the problem that you identified.
Awesome. So as we close today, we wanted to leave you with a quote that's actually from the Center on PBIS, and I'm going to read it out. There is no one right way to begin a deliberate focus on equity. The first step, even a small step, leads to another and another. Additionally, expect to be uncomfortable and to say and do things that result in people getting upset. System change is not easy, and addressing unequal outcomes adds a layer of discomfort based on generations of taboo, where we have been encouraged to not talk about differences, let alone the issues of unequal outcome based in those differences. This journey is never done. It is a dynamic process that requires constant reflection of current practices against desired outcome. The systems we inherit and operate in will not change without effort and discomfort, and understanding that stepping into this necessitates that discomfort in order for change to occur. And so we felt like this really speaks to the journey that we're going to take you on throughout this year. There will be times when you'll be uncomfortable. There will be times when you'll question. We hope that you do. We want you to be authentic in your honesty and your truth, and understanding how equity can really impact and inform your practices moving forward. And so we'd like to open it up for a few questions and see if there are some in the chat. And Amira and I are happy to take them. We'll try our best to answer them. I will say, and I'm sure Amira will say too, we don't have the magic bullet for everything, but we can try our best to give you some supports and some ideas. So with that, I'm going to leave you with our contact information, and you can reach us at any time. Please feel free to reach out if you do have questions outside of today's session, but I'm going to pause for a moment to see if there are questions in the chat. Okay, it looks like a lot of thank yous. Looking forward to the next sessions. That's awesome. We're excited too. We'll hang out for a couple minutes, and if you do want to stay on and have any questions for us, just let us know. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in November. Take care, everyone.
Thanks so much, guys.
Just as a follow-up, someone asked about the recording. We will put the recording on our PaTTAN YouTube channel. Please look for that in the upcoming maybe 2 or 3 weeks.